The janitor pushed his mop across the gleaming metal floor. The sound of the wet fibers dragging quietly echoed through the massive hallway. His hands worked mechanically, without a second thought. His mind was elsewhere, far removed from the daily grind of scrubbing alien ships. The massive guards stationed at the door didn't so much as glance in his direction. To them, he was invisible. Just another human, assigned to do the menial labor their own kind wouldn't bother with. That suited him just fine. The janitor's face, weathered and hardened by years of exposure, betrayed none of the thoughts running through his mind. His eyes, sharp and alert, darted briefly to the guards every now and then, unnoticed. They didn't realize how carefully he was studying them, their weapons, their routines. They were arrogant, as most of their kind were, secure in their belief that humans were weak, harmless. They had no idea what kind of person they had cleaning their floors. He took a moment to wring out the mop, and as he did, caught snippets of conversation between the guards. They were laughing, talking in their guttural language about the latest captured prisoner, a human, apparently caught trying to infiltrate their base. The janitor didn't react, but his interest was piqued. "Pathetic humans," one of the guards muttered. "They think they can resist us, but we'll break them. Like all the others." The other guard snorted. "They're nothing. Once we get what we need from this one, Earth will fall. It's only a matter of time." The janitor's hands paused for the briefest second before continuing to mop. His pulse quickened, but he remained outwardly calm. The guards weren't paying attention to him. They never did. They saw him as nothing more than a piece of the scenery. He wasn't about to correct them. Moving methodically, he finished up his task and returned his equipment to the cleaning closet. His steps were slow, deliberate, as he mentally filed away everything he just overheard. The alien guards had no idea that Earth's fall wasn't as inevitable as they thought. They certainly didn't know they were working alongside the very man who had once been one of Earth's most dangerous weapons. Inside the closet, he closed the door softly and leaned against the wall, allowing his thoughts to swirl. The guards had said the prisoner was a spy, likely trying to gather intel on alien operations. If they managed to break him, it could spell disaster for Earth. But that wasn't his problem anymore, was it? He wasn't a soldier. Not anymore. His job was to clean floors, not fight battles. He'd left that life behind, hadn't he? Yet something tugged at him. That old sense of duty he thought had died years ago. He could feel it stirring, scratching at the surface of his calm facade. He wasn't sure if it was anger or something else, but it gnawed at him, refusing to let go. He stared at the worn-down floor of the closet, the mop standing against the wall. To the world, he was just a janitor now. But he hadn't always been. Before this, before the quiet life, he had been something else entirely. He had been a soldier. No, more than that, he had been a weapon, a finely tuned machine of war. Earth's deadliest soldier. His hands, now accustomed to mops and brooms, had once held weapons capable of tearing through entire squads of enemies. But that was a different time. A different man. He sighed, rubbing his temples. He didn't want to go back to that. He had chosen this quiet life for a reason. The blood on his hands was enough to last a lifetime. But now, here he was, faced with a decision he hadn't wanted to make. Could he really just stand by and let Earth fall? Let a fellow human be tortured and broken by these aliens? He clenched his fists, trying to keep his mind clear. He had to think. This wasn't his fight. Not anymore. But as the seconds passed, the tension in his chest grew tighter. The thought of those aliens smugly talking about Earth's fall made his blood boil. They thought they knew humanity. They thought humans were weak. They didn't know him. Without thinking, his hand moved to the back of the closet, reaching for the hidden compartment he'd built weeks ago. Just in case. His fingers brushed the cool metal of the knife he'd stashed there, and the feel of it sent a jolt through his system. Muscle memory kicked in, and suddenly, he wasn't just a janitor anymore. His mind began to race, running through possible strategies, thinking about what he could do to sabotage the aliens' plans. He hesitated, knife in hand. His reflection stared back at him in the small, cracked mirror on the closet wall. He looked older, tired. But the fire in his eyes, buried under years of routine, was still there. He could feel it burning now, hotter with each passing moment. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They didn't know that Earth's deadliest soldier was standing right under their noses, hidden in plain sight. He slid the knife into the waistband of his uniform and straightened up. The decision had been made, whether he liked it or not. He could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline starting to course through his veins, awakening something inside him he had tried to bury for years. His hand reached for the mop one last time, but this time, not as a tool for cleaning. No, this time, it would be something else entirely, a weapon, a distraction, whatever he needed it to be. His mind was already working through the possibilities. He stepped out of the closet, calm and collected. The guards were still there, still laughing about the captured human. They didn't notice him approach. They didn't even bother to look. The janitor's lips curled into the faintest smile. It was time to remind them who they were dealing with. The mop clattered lightly as the janitor returned to his station, the familiar rhythm of his routine now masking a growing tension beneath the surface. His face was as impassive as ever, but inside, memories flickered like flames, pulling him back to a time when his life wasn't defined by cleaning floors but by ending lives. In the darkness of his mind, flashes of training camps, battlefields, and whispered orders resurfaced. He had been part of something much bigger than himself once, a hand-picked unit formed during humanity's darkest days. The wars with the alien coalition had been brutal, relentless. Earth's resources had been stretched thin, and its soldiers even more so. That's when they had called in men like him. The best of the best, trained to fight wars most would never survive. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a weapon. His team specialized in guerrilla tactics, infiltration, sabotage, whatever it took to bring down the enemy, often from behind their own lines. His hands had done things that would haunt most men, but he'd been forged in fire. The rules had been simple: survive, complete the mission, and don't look back. But after years of living like a ghost, after seeing too many faces of men he once called brothers fall, he'd walked away. Or tried to. He thought of that last mission, the one that had driven him to leave it all behind. They'd been deep inside enemy territory, a strike team tasked with disrupting a major alien offensive. The odds had been stacked against them from the start. The details were fuzzy now, blurred by time and guilt. But one thing stood out, sharp and clear: the failure. He had been the only one to make it back, the sole survivor. His superiors had called the mission a success, a strategic victory. He hadn't cared. The cost had been too high. That was the day he put down his rifle for good. But no matter how far he had run, no matter how many floors he scrubbed, the warrior inside him had never really died. He'd just been sleeping, waiting. Now, with every step through the alien facility, he felt the old instincts returning, piece by piece. His body remembered the drills, the routines. His mind, once dulled by the monotony of janitorial work, had snapped back into focus. He could feel every detail of the space around him: where the guards stood, how long their patrols took, where the cameras were likely watching. He moved through the corridors with purpose, every inch of the layout ingrained into his memory from weeks of working these halls. His cover had given him access to places the aliens would never suspect. It was ironic, really. In trying to hide from his past, he had inadvertently positioned himself perfectly to strike back when the time came. And now that time had come. He reached a quiet alcove and crouched down, his fingers reaching for a small compartment he had discovered during one of his cleaning rounds. Inside was a makeshift toolkit he'd assembled, nothing fancy, just the kind of supplies a janitor might have access to. But in his hands they were more than enough. A few cleaning chemicals here, a repurposed wire there. He could rig something simple but effective, enough to cause a distraction or disable security systems. His mind worked quickly, evaluating his options. He needed to act fast, but he couldn't be careless. If he was going to save the prisoner, he'd need to get in and out before the alien forces could regroup. And he needed to make sure the aliens never saw it coming. He couldn't afford mistakes. The janitor allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. How strange it was to be back in this headspace, planning an operation as if no time had passed. It was like slipping on an old coat. It still fit, and it was disturbingly comfortable. The thrill of it, the adrenaline, the rush, it all felt too familiar. He wasn't sure if he should be grateful or disgusted by how easily he fell back into the role. But there wasn't time to dwell on that now. He had made his choice. The quiet life was over, at least for now. His hands would get dirty again. They would remember the feel of weapons, of making split-second decisions that determined life or death. He would remember what it was to be that man again. He slipped from the alcove, his movements as silent as a shadow. The guards were oblivious, talking amongst themselves, bored and complacent. They had no idea what was coming for them. He passed unnoticed, his mind already ahead of him, calculating his next move. The prisoner was being held in one of the lower levels, a section heavily guarded and isolated from the rest of the facility. The alien leaders wanted to keep their prize safe, but in doing so, they had made a critical mistake. Isolating the prisoner meant fewer patrols, less oversight. They thought their security systems were enough, that no human would be foolish enough to try anything under their watchful eyes. They were wrong. The janitor reached a maintenance shaft, slipping inside with practiced ease. The cramped, dark space was familiar. He had cleaned it dozens of times. It led directly to the detention area. His heart rate remained steady, his breathing controlled. He wasn't nervous. There was no room for that now. He was in the zone, fully focused. As he moved through the shaft, he thought of the prisoner. A fellow human, someone fighting for Earth, just like he had once done. He didn't know who they were or what they had seen, but it didn't matter. They were his responsibility now. The aliens wouldn't break them. Not while he still had the power to stop it. He reached the end of the shaft and peered through the small vent into the room below. 2 guards stood outside the prisoner's cell, their weapons at the ready but their postures relaxed. They weren't expecting trouble. The janitor smirked to himself. That was their first mistake. The janitor eased out of the vent, landing silently behind the guards. They were still oblivious to his presence, completely absorbed in their boredom. It was almost too easy. His hand gripped the knife he had hidden in his waistband. It wasn't a weapon he would have chosen during his days as a soldier, but it would do the job now. Quick, quiet, and efficient, that's what he needed. With a swift, practiced motion, he struck. The first guard didn't have time to react, his body slumping to the floor without so much as a gasp. The second guard barely turned before the janitor had him pinned, his blade finding its mark with the same lethal precision. It was over in seconds. The janitor stood over them, wiping the blade clean with a calm that came from years of experience. The door to the cell was locked, but that didn't slow him down. He knew the systems here as well as anyone. A few swift movements, and the lock was bypassed. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing the human prisoner, beaten but still conscious, tied to a chair. The prisoner's eyes widened as they met the janitor's, a mix of confusion and relief flashing across their face. "You!" the prisoner rasped, disbelief in their voice. The janitor ignored the question, stepping forward to cut the bindings. "Can you walk?" His voice was low, measured. There wasn't time for explanations. The prisoner nodded, shaky but determined. They struggled to their feet, wincing from the pain but managing to stay upright. The janitor steadied them with a firm grip, his eyes scanning the room, always alert. He knew they didn't have much time. The bodies outside would be discovered soon, and the facility would go into lockdown. "We need to move," he said, guiding the prisoner toward the door. The escape wasn't going to be easy, but the janitor had planned for this. He'd mapped out every possible route in his head, calculated every guard rotation. He led the prisoner through the corridors with an almost uncanny ability to avoid detection. They moved in silence, the janitor's senses heightened, aware of every noise, every flicker of movement. Years of training had honed him into the perfect soldier, and now, all that training was being put to use again. As they moved deeper into the facility, the janitor began laying traps, small, improvised devices he had crafted from his cleaning supplies. Simple, but effective. He wasn't trying to take down the entire facility, just buy them enough time to get out. Every delay, every diversion was another step closer to freedom. The prisoner limped beside him, struggling to keep up but not complaining. They knew the stakes. One wrong move and it was over. The janitor could see the fear in their eyes, but there was something else there too, hope. Hope that somehow, against all odds, they might actually survive this. The janitor didn't share that hope. He wasn't one for optimism. He was a realist. He knew the odds, knew how thin the line they were walking was. But that didn't change his resolve. He had made a choice, and now, he was going to see it through. Failure wasn't an option. They reached a junction in the hallway, and the janitor held up a hand, signaling the prisoner to stop. His ears picked up the faint sound of footsteps, multiple pairs, moving quickly. The patrol had changed course. They were heading straight for them. His mind raced, calculating options. They were too exposed here. There was no way they could take on an entire patrol head-on, not without raising alarms. He glanced at the prisoner, then at a nearby maintenance hatch. It was a tight fit, but it would have to do. He motioned for the prisoner to follow him, quickly opening the hatch and climbing inside. The prisoner followed without question, wincing as they squeezed through the narrow opening. The janitor pulled the hatch shut just as the patrol rounded the corner. They waited in silence, barely breathing as the footsteps grew louder. The patrol passed by, unaware of the two humans hiding just feet away. The janitor didn't relax until the footsteps faded into the distance. Even then, he knew they were still far from safe. He crawled through the cramped space, leading the way toward the next exit point. It was slow going, but they couldn't afford to rush. Every movement had to be calculated, deliberate. One wrong step and they would be discovered. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the shaft, slipping back into the main corridor. They were getting closer to the exit now, but the janitor knew the hardest part was still ahead. The final checkpoint was heavily guarded, and there was no way to bypass it like the others. They would have to fight their way through. He paused, glancing at the prisoner. "Stay close to me. When I move, you move." The prisoner nodded, their face pale but determined. They understood what was coming. The janitor steeled himself. He didn't enjoy this part, but it was necessary. He had spent years trying to leave the violence behind, but in the end, it had found him again. And now, he was going to finish what he had started. They approached the checkpoint, and as expected, the guards were stationed there, heavily armed and ready for trouble. But they weren't ready for him. In a blur of motion, the janitor moved. His knife flashed in the dim light as he closed the distance between them. The first guard went down before they even realized what was happening, a silent strike to the throat. The second guard barely had time to raise his weapon before the janitor disarmed him with brutal efficiency, the sound of bone cracking under the force of his blow. The prisoner watched in stunned silence as the janitor took down each guard with precision and speed. It was over in seconds, the hallway littered with bodies. The janitor wiped his knife clean, his expression unchanged. "Let's go," he said, his voice cold, focused. There was no time to dwell on what had just happened. They were almost out. The exit loomed ahead, and for the first time, the janitor allowed himself to think they might actually make it. The alarms still hadn't sounded. They had managed to slip through unnoticed, like ghosts in the shadows. But he knew better than to let his guard down. The exit was just ahead, but the janitor knew the hardest part was still to come. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't over yet. His senses sharpened as he scanned the area, every instinct telling him that something wasn't right. He'd been in too many situations like this before, where things seemed to be going too smoothly. As they approached the final doors, a sharp sound echoed down the hall. His body reacted before his mind did, pushing the prisoner back against the wall and flattening himself beside them. A second later, the heavy stomp of alien boots reverberated through the corridor. Backup had arrived. A squad of alien soldiers marched into view, heavily armed and far more alert than the ones they had encountered before. These weren't the lazy, overconfident guards from earlier. These soldiers were prepared for a fight, their weapons drawn and eyes scanning the hallway. They hadn't spotted the janitor or the prisoner yet, but it wouldn't take long. The janitor's mind raced. He was outnumbered and outgunned. A direct confrontation would be suicide, but there wasn't time to set up another ambush. He needed a new plan, and fast. He glanced around, his eyes falling on the overhead piping system. An idea formed. He grabbed the prisoner by the arm, pulling them toward a maintenance ladder that led to the upper walkway. "Follow me. Quickly." They climbed as quietly as possible, the janitor moving with the speed and grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The prisoners struggled to keep up, their injuries slowing them down, but they managed to reach the top without drawing attention. From above, the janitor could see the entire squad, their formation tight and disciplined. This wasn't going to be easy, but he had faced worse odds before. He moved along the narrow platform, positioning himself directly above the soldiers. The prisoner stayed behind, watching him with wide eyes, clearly unsure of what was about to happen. The janitor didn't hesitate. He reached for one of the pipes, carefully twisting the release valve. There was a hiss as steam began to pour from the system, flooding the corridor below. The aliens reacted instantly, their vision obscured as the thick cloud of steam enveloped them. Confusion spread through their ranks, and that was all the janitor needed. He dropped down into the chaos, moving with lethal precision. The first alien didn't even have time to register what was happening before the janitor struck, his knife cutting through the fog. The second alien swung blindly, firing wildly into the mist, but the janitor was already behind him, ending the fight before it even began. The rest of the squad was in disarray, firing in all directions as they tried to regain control. But the janitor was already moving, slipping between them like a shadow, his movements quick and efficient. One by one, the aliens fell, their bodies hitting the floor with barely a sound. Within minutes, the steam began to clear, revealing the aftermath. The janitor stood in the center of the hallway, the bodies of the alien soldiers scattered around him. His breathing was steady, his focus unbroken. He wiped the blade of his knife on his uniform and turned back toward the prisoner, who was staring at him in stunned silence. "You're not just a janitor," the prisoner said, their voice barely above a whisper. The janitor didn't respond. There was no point in explaining. He had been something else once, something deadly. But that wasn't who he wanted to be anymore. Right now, all that mattered was getting them both out of here alive. He motioned for the prisoner to follow him, and they moved quickly toward the exit. The facility's alarm still hadn't gone off, but it wouldn't be long before someone realized what had happened. They had to move fast. They reached the final set of doors, and the janitor quickly accessed the control panel, overriding the security system. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the open sky outside. Freedom. They were almost there. But as they stepped through, a shadow loomed in front of them. The janitor's instincts kicked in just in time. He shoved the prisoner to the side, barely dodging the massive alien that lunged toward them. This one was different, bigger, faster, and far more dangerous than the others. It was the leader, the one in charge of this facility, and it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The janitor squared off against the alien, his eyes narrowing as he assessed his opponent. This wasn't going to be like the others. This one was a warrior, just like him. The alien spoke in its guttural language, taunting him, mocking humanity's weakness. But the janitor wasn't listening. His focus was entirely on the fight ahead. The alien charged, its massive frame barreling toward him with terrifying speed. The janitor sidestepped at the last second, driving his knife into the alien's side. But it wasn't enough. The alien barely flinched, its thick hide absorbing most of the blow. It swung its arm, catching the janitor across the chest and sending him crashing into the wall. Pain shot through his body, but he pushed it aside, forcing himself to his feet. He couldn't afford to slow down, not now. The alien advanced again, its eyes filled with rage. The janitor dodged another blow, But he knew he couldn't keep this up forever. The alien was stronger, faster. He needed to find a weakness. His mind raced as he ducked and weaved, avoiding the alien's attacks. There had to be something. His eyes flickered to the control panel near the door. That was it. He just needed to lure the alien close enough. He let the alien close the distance, feigning exhaustion. The alien took the bait, charging at him with full force. At the last second, the janitor dove out of the way, slamming his hand against the control panel. The door behind the alien slammed shut with a deafening clang, trapping it inside. The alien roared in frustration, pounding on the door, but it was too late. The janitor had already sealed it. He stood there for a moment, catching his breath, before turning to the prisoner. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion creeping into his limbs. They made their way out into the open, the cold air hitting their faces as they finally left the facility behind. The prisoner looked at him with a mixture of awe and confusion, clearly still trying to process everything that had just happened. But the janitor didn't offer any explanations. There was no need. They had made it. For now, that was enough. The cold night air was sharp against their skin as they hurried away from the alien facility. The janitor led the way, his steps quick and purposeful. The prisoner struggled to keep pace but didn't complain. The escape had been brutal, but it was far from over. They were outside now, yes, but they were still on enemy territory. He knew this wasn't the time to relax. They moved in silence through the shadows, the terrain rough and unfamiliar. The alien facility loomed behind them, a dark silhouette against the night sky, but the janitor didn't look back. He never did. Once the mission was done, you kept moving forward, that was the rule. Reflecting on what happened, second-guessing, it was all a waste of time. Time they didn't have. He scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of pursuit. It wouldn't be long before the aliens realized something had gone wrong. Maybe they already had. But for now, they were in the clear, and he was going to take full advantage of that. His mind was already working on the next step. They needed to get far enough away to avoid detection, find shelter, and regroup. The prisoner limped behind him, wincing with each step. "How far do we need to go?" they asked, their voice tight with exhaustion. "Far enough that they won't find us right away," the janitor replied, his tone clipped. He didn't bother with reassurances or soft words. There wasn't any point. He couldn't guarantee their safety, and pretending otherwise would just be a lie. The truth was, they were still in danger. He led them toward a rocky outcropping, the terrain offering some cover from aerial scans. Once they reached the shelter of the rocks, the janitor slowed down, allowing the prisoner a moment to catch their breath. The prisoner collapsed against the rocks, gasping for air, while the janitor kept watch, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. His body remained tense, always ready, always on edge. Minutes passed in silence, the only sound the prisoner's labored breathing. Finally, the janitor crouched beside them, pulling out a small water canister from his jacket and handing it over. The prisoner took it gratefully, their hands shaking as they drank. The janitor watched them closely, assessing their condition. They had been through hell, no doubt about it, but they were still standing. That meant something. "Why did you do it?" the prisoner asked, their voice rough from thirst. "Why help me? You didn't have to." The janitor didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure he even had a good answer. It wasn't something he'd planned, not really. But when he had heard the guards talking about the invasion, when he'd seen the prisoner in that cell, something inside him had clicked. It wasn't about being a hero. He wasn't that. He'd left the hero stuff behind a long time ago. But he couldn't just walk away. Not when Earth was at stake. "Someone had to," he finally said, his voice low. "You wouldn't have lasted much longer in there." The prisoner nodded, but they still looked confused. "But you're just a janitor." He almost laughed at that, the corner of his mouth twitching into a brief smile. It was the same thing everyone thought, the same thing the aliens had believed. Just a janitor. He had spent so long hiding, trying to convince himself that he could be someone else, something else, that he had almost forgotten the truth himself. "I was a soldier once," he said, his tone flat, almost detached. "A long time ago." The prisoner stared at him, clearly trying to process the information. "You were more than a soldier," they said, their voice soft. "The way you fought, you're something else." He didn't respond to that. There was nothing to say. The past was the past. The only thing that mattered now was surviving. He wasn't doing this for glory or recognition. He didn't want medals or thanks. He was doing it because he could, because someone had to stop the aliens from getting what they wanted. "Can you walk?" he asked, shifting the conversation back to practical matters. The prisoner nodded, pushing themselves up with a groan. They were weak, but they were still moving, and that was all that mattered right now. The janitor helped them to their feet and then started moving again, always keeping to the shadows, always alert. The terrain became rougher as they moved further away from the facility. The sky above was dark, only the faint light of distant stars guiding their path. The janitor knew they were getting closer to the extraction point, but there were still miles to go. His body moved on autopilot, his training kicking in as he navigated the difficult terrain. Every step was deliberate, calculated. His mind remained focused, thinking 3 steps ahead. Suddenly, the faint sound of engines cut through the silence, a low hum that grew louder by the second. The janitor stopped, his hand motioning for the prisoner to do the same. He listened intently, his eyes narrowing as the sound approached. A ship. A patrol, no doubt. They were looking for them. "Down," he whispered, pushing the prisoner behind a cluster of rocks. They crouched low, the janitor positioning himself between the prisoner and the open air. The hum grew louder, and soon, the shadow of the patrol ship passed overhead, sweeping the ground with a bright searchlight. The janitor stayed perfectly still, his eyes locked on the light as it passed just inches away from their hiding spot. The tension was suffocating, the prisoner barely daring to breathe. But the janitor remained calm, his focus unbroken. The light moved on, sweeping the area before the ship finally veered off into the distance. It wasn't gone for good, but they had bought themselves a few more minutes. Once the sound of the engines faded completely, the janitor stood, pulling the prisoner up with him. "We need to move," he said, his voice low but urgent. They kept going, their pace quicker now. The patrols would be increasing, and the window for escape was closing fast. But the janitor had one last trick up his sleeve. He had arranged for an extraction, a rendezvous point where they could be picked up if they made it far enough. They just needed to get there before the aliens caught up. The final stretch was the hardest. The janitor could feel his body growing tired, his muscles aching from the constant movement. But he pushed through it, focusing on each step, each breath. The extraction point was just ahead. They were so close. At last, they reached the designated spot, a small clearing surrounded by rocks, hidden from view. The janitor pulled out a small transmitter, sending the signal that would bring their ride. They had made it. The prisoner collapsed onto the ground, exhausted but alive. They looked up at the janitor with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "I don't know who you are," they said, "but thank you." The janitor just nodded, his expression unreadable. He wasn't looking for thanks. He wasn't looking for anything. He had done what needed to be done, nothing more. As the extraction ship approached, the janitor glanced back toward the direction of the alien facility. The mission was over, but the fight wasn't. It never really was. But for now, they were safe. And that was enough.